I got several requests to correct Bill Whittle's video, Is Climate Change Real? As always, I'll list all his sources as well as my own peer-reviewed scientific sources in the video description so that you can check them for yourselves. Let's take all his claims in chronological order. We'll start with this projection for global sea level, which is currently rising at the rate of about 3 millimeters a year. See now, 3 millimeters a year. That means in 100 years, I wish I had a science go. Why, here to check me numbers, we'll be up to 300 millimeters. Boy, that's 11.8 inches. That's almost a foot. Whittle's 5-second calculation assumes that the rate of sea level rise remains constant. But we all know that when the climate's changing, the sea level doesn't remain constant. According to researchers, sea level rise will soon start to accelerate. Firstly, because we're seeing accelerating melt from ice sheets and glaciers, and because ocean temperatures are rising and warmer oceans leads to thermal expansion. There were a couple of ways to work out how much sea level rise we'll get from these two phenomena. One is to figure out on paper how much us ought to melt and how much the oceans ought to expand due to a given rise in global temperature. And that gave an average figure of about 3 feet by the end of this century. The other method is to see how much sea levels have risen in the past in response to a similar increase in global temperature. And when two different studies measured that, they found that the answer again came to about 3 feet by the end of this century. I'm only looking at the average, so here are the exact figures for various different studies. A more recent study has now doubled that estimate to around 6 feet by the end of this century. And after that, of course, they would keep rising. Whittle broached this subject because he was criticizing Bill Nye for talking in a video about a sea level rise of 70 meters if all the Bill on Earth melts, without mentioning that this process would take thousands of years. If all this ice melts, the ocean is going to have more water in it. So the sea levels, as measured from the coasts, is going to go up. It's going to go up 70 meters. And Whittle's right to criticize. Nye should have told people that this will take thousands of years. Al Gore did the same thing when he talked about a rise of 20 feet, but didn't mention the timeline. By the same token, Whittle has an obligation to report the sea level studies and not make up his own sea level projection based on a spurious calculation in his head. If he thinks all these studies are wrong, then he needs to explain why. Because whether you want to accept these studies or not, whether you think these conclusions are important or not, you still have a right to know about them, just as you have a right to know how long it'll take for all the ice to melt. Science tells us that during the late Cretaceous period, around 80 million years ago or so, Kansas was directly under the western interior seaway. It was a vast inland ocean, 2,000 miles long, 600 miles wide, and 2,500 feet deep. But 80 million years ago, Cottle levels were about 1,000 parts per million. In fact, during the Cambrian period, 500 million years ago, Cottle levels were perhaps 7,000 parts per million. Now we have to join up the dots and hear the other half of the story. Whittle's quite right. During the late Cretaceous, Cottle levels were about 1,000 parts per million compared to 400 million today and 7,000 parts per million during the Cambrian. So what was the consequence of these high levels of Cottle? According to science, as Whittle puts it, they should have caused much stronger global warming than we see today. And they did. During both periods, it was so hot that the ice melted at the poles. And what was the result? Sea level rise. During the Cretaceous, combined with eustatic movement, it led to the highest sea level in several 100 million years. This is the rest of the world during the Cretaceous. So Whittle was right in saying cotton levels were much higher during the Cretaceous. And he was right in saying that half of the Usa was underwater during the Cretaceous, but he didn't explain the connection. Al Gore and the rest of the crowd sold the American people, in fact the entire world, on this. This is a graph of pretty much stable temperatures than a drastic, unprecedented rise corresponding to fossil fuel use. This chart that they used goes back 1,000 years. Whoa. Hey, here's a world temperature chart that goes back 11,000 years. The little red bar you see is the length of the hockey stick sample that got this ball rolling in the first place. Well, not quite. What got this ball rolling was a theory by Svante Arrhenius in 1894 that since Cotto traps long-wave radiation, an increase in the concentration of atmospheric cot. That theory was refined by Guy Stewart Callender in the 1930s and 40s and confirmed by a number of researchers in the 1950s and 60s. As for this reconstruction, it was just the first of a dozen reconstructions, each one showing a steep rise in temperatures over the last 100 years. But the point Whittle wants to make is that we need to compare this to global temperatures over the last 11,000 years. So let's go back to this reconstruction. What was it again? Here's world temperature chart. If it's a world temperature chart, why does it say just to Greenland? It took me less than a minute to discover that this reconstruction is based on just one location, the Jisptu drilling site on top of the Greenland ice sheet. Here's the original graph that Whittle used. It comes from a blog and it seems to be a faithful reproduction of the data, but as we all see in a minute, it's a bit misleading. First, let's remind ourselves of Whittle's claim. The little red bar you see is the length of the hockey stick sample that got this ball rolling in the first place. The problem is whoever added the red line for Bill Whittle's video either assumed or pretended that the reconstruction ends at roughly the same time as the hockey stick curve, but it does. The hockey stick ends roughly in the year 2000, as is shown on the scale. The Jisptu graph ends in 0, which represents the present. Now you may think that that means the year 2000 or 2017 or whenever the graph was made, but it doesn't. To avoid confusion like this and make reconstructions consistent, scientists always use the year 1950 as a baseline. So on the Jisptu data set here, or before present means before 1950. Wait, there's more. If we zoom in on the small time period we're talking about, the last 1,000 years, we can see that the data even stopped short of 1950. And that's not a few years short, it's several decades short, because this black line represents 500 years. So what is the end point? To find out, I accessed the raw data from Jisptu, which is freely available on the internet. And it turns out that the youngest data sample is 0.951,409,000 years before present. 400, that is 100, 0.951,409,000 years is 95 years, and before present means before 1950. So 95 years before 1950 is 1855. So, in fact, the data graph ends in 1855, decades before the sharp increase in warming shown by the hockey stick graphs. So that's comparing chalk and cheese. Let's compare like with like. Firstly, we'll look at global temperatures over the last 11,000 years, which is what Whittle claimed he was showing us. And we'll take temperatures up to the 21st century instead of 1855. This study by Marcotte et al. In 2013 does exactly that. The gray curves at the end show instrumental data representing the rise in temperatures since 1950. As you can see, temperatures are now the highest they've been in the last 11,000 years. And the rise is steep and sudden over the last 100 years, completely in line with the sudden rise of the hockey stick curve. Sudden over the sudden, this is one the quantity Here's the last 1,000 years covered by the hockey stick graph, also reflecting that sudden rise. Again, this sudden increase in temperature may not bother you, but Whittle has an obligation to at least present you with these facts. Otherwise, he's only telling half the story. So let's just run that clip of Whittle again, this time putting in the graph he's describing, which is world temperatures, and the timescale he's claiming to cover, which is up to the 21st century. Here's a world temperature chart that goes back 11,000 years. The little red bar you see is the length of the hockey stick sample that got this ball rolling in the first place. What a difference that makes. Back to the wrong graph and more of the video. Temperatures have been in constant flux for the last 11,000 years, and the last 450,000 years. and for the last 4.6 billion years. There's nothing before that here on Earth. The blue line here, by the way, is temperature. The purple is Cottu levels. Now there's a scientific term for this delta, this rise and fall of temperatures, and that scientific term is called change. Constant rhythmic climate change, and nothing but constant rhythmic climate change going back not 1,000 years, but 4.6 billion years. The climate's always changing. It's like warning us about daylight change because the sun is getting closer to the horizon. That's true, but there's kind of more to the story, isn't there? Yes, there's much more to the story. Scientists haven't spent the last 100 years discovering that climate's always changing. They've been discovering why it changes. Whittle's hinted at the reason, so let's fill in the other half of the story. As Whittle explained, the Cambrian period had exceptionally high levels of Cottu, around 7,000 parts per million, compared to 400 today. The result was hyperwarming and the Cambrian hothouse. And this happened at a time when solar output was about 4 weaker, which should have caused an ice age. It was carbon dioxide that kept the planet not just warm, but much hotter than now. And since then, carbon dioxide has been on a slow downward cooling trend, with occasional rises in co-concentration that sent temperatures back up. But if we look at the reconstruction behind Whittle, which comes from a blog, what he's trying to show us is that there seems to be no correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. What he doesn't show us is that the same temperature graph set against solar luminosity also shows no correlation. So here's the other half of the story. Over the last 500 million years, as Cottu levels have trended downwards, solar luminosity has been trending upwards. In other words, the sun's been getting hotter. You don't need a physics degree to know that the sun is an important influence on global temperature. So if the sun's been getting steadily hotter, why has the Earth also been getting steadily hotter? There's no correlation at all. But when researchers factored in the effect of the sun and Cottu on global temperatures, they got a very good correlation. Since the sun's rising output has been slow and predictable, it's the ups and downs of carbon dioxide that forced the changes in global temperature. That's why carbon dioxide has been called the Earth thermostat and the primary driver of Phanerozoic climate. A couple of quick questions for you, Science Goose. How did Cottu levels go from a Cambrian high of 7,000 parts per million to a quaternary low of about 180 parts per million without Bill Nye, Al Gore, Leonardo DiCaprio? Without Bill, Aquavel, Power, Power, I will bell bell will bell bell review Well, that's easy because the answer can be looked up in any good geology textbook. Carbon dioxide was removed over time through chemical weathering. This is a process by which K2O and water from the atmosphere make carbonic acid, which reacts with rock minerals to form carbonates. The most common reaction is with calcium silicates, making calcium carbonate. This gets washed out to sea, where it eventually sinks and forms a sedimentary rock called limestone. Carbon was also taken out of the atmosphere by living organisms and buried as coal and oil. And to answer the other part of Bill's question, yes, all this really did happen without Bill Nye or Leonardo DiCaprio. By the way, this isn't my theory. I'm a complete dunce. I'm just reporting what researchers have concluded through a century of solid evidence. Anyone can look this up by spending 5 minutes at the local library or searching scientific papers online. The removal of atmospheric K2 over 200 million years brought the concentration down to a low point during the Carboniferous. Then over a few million years it went shooting back up again thanks to a flood basalt event called the Siberian Traps. A flood basalt is caused by a weak area of crust that sends out thousands of cubic miles of molten rock, in this case covering a large part of Siberia. That event released huge amounts of K2. It's important to note that the build-up of K2 sent temperatures soaring. At the end of it there was a mass extinction event, wiping out 90 of the species on Earth. Some researchers have found evidence that the Earth became so warm it caused methane hydrates on the sea floor to vaporize, adding even more K2 and accelerating the warming. Then the process of weathering out the carbon dioxide began again. Next question. Whose factories and auto emissions got K2 to 2.5 times current levels 80 million years ago? Another answer that can be easily found in any geology textbook. First build. You have to get away from the crazy idea that carbon dioxide can only be produced by cars and factories. You said the same thing in an interview with Front Page Mag, where you explained why you started questioning climate science in the first place. I thought, well, if it was ice-free 20 million years ago, whose subs caused it to be ice-free 20 million years ago? Again, you seem to think that subs and modern industrial machines are the only things that can produce huge quantities of K2. Something else can do it, a flood basalt. Fortunately, we're not experiencing any of these at the moment. But in answer to your question, the increase in carbon dioxide 80 million years ago was caused by a flood basalt event called the Vcodec Traps. Just as in Siberia, it produced thousands of cubic miles of basalt and billions of tons of carbon dioxide. You can still see this basalt today. After that, the slow weathering process continued, bringing atmospheric K2 concentration back to the level it was during the Carboniferous. 2.5 million years ago, that's the period covered by that tiny blue line you can see in the corner, an ice age began, and the Earth has been cycling in and out of glaciations every 30,000 years or so, as a wobble in the Earth's tilt and orbit allowed a little more or a little less sunlight to fall on Earth, and this in turn either degassed or dissolved K2 in the as the sea. This regular cycle of glaciation and deglaciation is the reconstruction Whittle's showing here. But all he said about this was that they show the climate's changed. He left out the reason why it's changed and the crucial part that carbon dioxide has played in those changes. The posts I'm going to get in response to this video are so predictable I can address them in advance. First, there are going to be the what about questions, repeating myths that are circulating on the internet. You all find all these myths addressed in me climate change videos, so check out the video description here to find out where you all find your favorite myth addressed. Then there'll all be a flood of posts complaining about me voice, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to write in and tell me I missed the point. There are various points, but the main one would be that Whittle isn't attacking climate science. He's attacking left-wing idiots who don't tell the whole story. Yes, I get it. See, this video isn't about temperatures. It's about the fundamental integrity of science being weaponized into politics. And I couldn't agree more. I don't care whether it's left-wingers or right-wingers misrepresenting the science. Any misrepresentation of science is wrong. So for the 28 seconds Whittle spent criticizing Bill Nye, omission of the melt time scale, I heartily concur. But then Whittle spends the rest of the video, the next 8 minutes, not attacking left-wingers, but promoting his own view of climate science and misrepresenting the conclusions of peer-reviewed scientific studies. In other words, doing exactly what Bill Nye did and more. Whittle only told us half the story by talking about past sea level rise and past carbon dioxide rise without telling us the connection between the two. He mentioned past CO2 levels of 7,000 and 1,000 without mentioning the hothouse conditions that resulted. He was telling us again and again that the climate always changes while leaving out half the story, the scientific explanation as to why the climate changes. And he left out the crucial role of the sun in past climate change. Telling half of that truth is not science, it's fraud. That's pretty damning. But I am not done yet. Those were just the crucial facts you left out. Bill. Worse still are the parts of your video where you misled people, telling us the data shows sea level rise will be less than a foot by the end of the century, when in fact studies conclude there will be a sea level rise 3 times higher. And you retelling us that this is a reconstruction of world temperatures when it's not, and telling us this portion represents the period of the hockey stick curve when it doesn't, and that misrepresentation meant people could get to see real world temperatures and the real nature of recent temperature increase for themselves. Now we come to the thorny question of why Bill Whittle didn't tell the whole story and couldn't answer his own questions and even misrepresented the science. After all, is he a scientist? I taught astronomy for 20 years and I've been a technician in a geochronology lab using thermoluminescence to date pottery shards. So while I may not be a climate scientist, and neither is Bill Nye, by the way, who has a degree in mechanical engineering, I at least know what real science looks like. But I couldn't find any record of Whittle having any qualifications in astronomy or teaching astronomy. The best I could find was that he told Front Page Mag in that interview, I worked as an astronomy lab assistant and I worked in a geochronology lab for 4 to 5 years, so we know a little bit about science. But it doesn't matter if you've got aft. Even someone who knows a little bit about science should have been able to look stuff up. I'm a complete dunce, but even I managed to find the other half of the story. Neither is his impressive 20 years teaching astronomy mentioned anywhere in the Bill Whittle wrote for himself on his YouTube channel. Teaching the king of the real fancy you doing fairly wait when we Instead, it's all about politics. Bill Whittle is considered by many Politico insiders to be the hottest up and coming conservative political commentator and American heritage philosopher of his time. Now Whittle can rail against the politicization of science when it comes to social sciences, feminism, gender identity, and all the other stuff that seems to be preoccupying so many people in the United States these days. So by definition a lot of that is political. But Whittle goes on for the rest of the video to misrepresent hard sciences like physics, geology, and glaciology. Why would a political commentator who only knows a little bit about science want to do that? It's about the fundamental integrity of science being weaponized into politics. I couldn't have put it better myself.